I mentioned at the start of the show we have Kyle Shideler joining us. We'll see him in a moment. He's joining us by Skype. But and as I say, the end of the segment of the show, we're going to talk a lot more closely about the election results. But Kyle Shideler with the Center for Security Policy joined us at least one other time, I think a couple other times. He is our Director and Senior Analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. He specializes in Islamist groups operating in the U.S. He joined us previously as we were talking about the ideological as well as the monetary roots of Antifa. Where'd they come from? Who funds them? What do they really think? He is going to join us today talking about what's happened in Washington, D.C. last night on election night as the individuals who come from the shutdown D.C. movement, who are obviously, have locked arms with Antifa, Black Lives Matter, other radical anti-American groups, have had all planned major violence in Washington last night. I guess it's a little bit of a, silver lining to the fact that the election isn't yet decided, that the rioters and destroyers and arsonists and murderers weren't quite as sure they wanted to be out in the streets yet because they weren't sure what they had to protest, weren't sure what the outcome was going to be. But we're going to hear him talk about that and also talk about a piece he wrote, which ties in well what I was talking about in the first segment, which was essentially the kind of fight we're now moving into. We passed the election day yesterday, early voting on election day, and now we're in the street fight to get to the right answer, to get the conclusion of what happened in the 2020 election. So, Kyle Shideler, I believe we have on line. Hello, sir.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Love having you. Good to see you, sir. Well, I want to start with your, first of all, thank you for your great writing. You wrote a piece that I think was originally in the American Mind, and actually for our listeners, it's on our website at americacanwetalk.org. On the homepage under shows, drop down list of links, you can read this article, but it says, can the right win a 2020 election street fight? And that was a caption of your article. And I know you aren't talking about getting out and beating people up in the streets, but what are you talking about in terms of 2020 election and the street fight?
Sure. Well, so the term street fight is not my term. That is a quote from the Transition Integrity Project, which was a group of primarily Democrats and some never-Trumpers that were alleging that the president would refuse to leave office if he were to lose the election, and that they should therefore be prepared if necessary, to remove him from power. And they said that the scenario would ultimately be a, quote, street fight, not a legal fight. So that's where that term comes from. But the idea was that they would seek to put into the streets protesters in order to make people believe that the American people want Trump to go, that they do not believe that Trump won the election. And so that was the scenario that they were painting. So what I was saying in that article at the American Mind was, if that's the case, if this is what they choose to do, if on election night it appears, as the scenario now is playing out, that President Trump believes, with some reason, that he has won or was winning on election night, that there are a number of states that are still openly contested, some questions about counting and eligible votes in those states. So those things are all things that need to get decided. Now, in our system, those things are decided legally. They're decided by lawyers and teams of lawyers, and that's what we should expect. And America has a stable process for doing that. But the goal of groups like Shut Down DC, which is one of the organizations that you mentioned, is to distract from that and to make it a battle which is fought in the media, and by convincing people that large groups of people oppose the president and will not allow him to be reelected.
One thing that people love about President Trump, several commentators picked up in the language from the Transition Integrity Project about a street fight, and they're making the point that, they're talking about this transition integrity people maybe having to, take it out into the streets. But part of what people love about President Trump is he will certainly use a legal team and pursue every legal avenue to try to get an accurate vote. I actually think there is tremendous real integrity on the side of the Republicans of President Trump. I think they'll use every legal and genuine, honest means of getting to the right result, getting to the fair result, the legal result of the election. But people also love the term street fight. Can sometimes it has a more broad meaning, but the idea President Trump will engage in the battle of the public discussion. He'll engage in the put out his point of view, make his argument, try to use Twitter, although they're increasingly censoring him. But he'll get in the battle in the American political conversation, and he won't just sit silently in his office and let the lawyers duke it out. And I think that's one reason that people were thrilled President Trump. One, because they see him as a fighter at this time when the left is so mobilized to be fighting against him.
And I think also one thing that the president knows very well, and you see this with his omnipresent rallies, which were a big deal in 2016 and also a big deal in 2020, is that he understands that you have to bring people together in a real space. And this shows that you have real support. This is basic politics 101. But in this big tech era, we've gotten away from it to quite a degree. But President Trump realizes something that the left has long believed, which is that you have to be able to put real supporters in a real space where they can be seen, and so that people know that you have support. And so that this is going to be very important moving forward. While President Trump and his team consider the legal issues, as they absolutely should be doing, they need to remember, they need to keep their morale of their supporters high. They should be considering holding rallies, drawing attention to the support that the president has, and that his supporters want to see this process taken to its fair and legal and logical conclusion. And that they're not going to abandon the president just because some media entity or another has made a call based on statistics.
Yeah, actually, I love that point. And there were many people commenting about in Butler, Pennsylvania, the enormous rally. I think it was the day before the election, I think, where there were some numbers as high, estimating 60,000, but these massive pictures of people. And they're just effusive. And as many people point out, this is at a Trump rally, Butler, Pennsylvania. No one goes to those rallies because they want to, learn some new campaign slogans or hear some new policy ideas. They already know more or less what he's going to say. He's going to effuse love of America, love of freedom, love of the idea of free markets and secure borders, all his policy themes. It's the most amazing phenomenon to watch. People go watch him even though they already know what he's going to say. And I love the idea. And I actually had someone contact me this morning saying, too bad they can't get all those Butler, Pennsylvania people who went to cheer on President Trump at the rally to show up outside where they're counting votes, not to commit violence, but just to say, we're watching you. We're the ones who like him, and we are really not sure that you're doing the right thing here. We're very worried you're trying to steal the election. I kind of love that. And you're right that President Trump has used his ability to galvanize crowds, to bring rallies together. It cements for people comfort in supporting him. They look around and realize, wow, I'm not the only one. I love this guy speaking about love America. I love this guy speaking about all his issues, strong national security and secure borders and a fair immigration system and free markets, all that. So I love that he has used crowds and that in-person contact to tremendous advantage, both in the previous election in 2016 and this time. So your article, I want to make sure I give it a due credit because I love that. I love that people are attacking the Transition Integrity Project. And I mean, the premise of it is, of course, is that everyone knows Biden will win. So if he doesn't, here's what we're going to do. Is that about right?
That's exactly right. And I think we saw this play out last night with elements of the media where they attempted to put their thumb on the scale of when certain states were called, and it's all about an image, creating an image of an event that's not occurring, that things aren't happening the way that we think they're happening. Right, and this is where the Transition Integrity Project and these sorts of groups were functioning and what they were calling for. It's an information operation, is what we would say in the strategy space. It's about convincing people that something is happening that is not happening.
Yeah, and then of course once they do that, I love the information operation. I'm writing that. I love when you use that expression. Other people have too on my show. It's exactly what it is. It is to shape and mold public opinion. So people hold a certain view, and they assume that if there is a hesitancy on the part of President Trump, if he were to have lost the election, hesitancy to announce that immediately, to congratulate Biden or something that would give them a chance to pounce and say, see, he's never going to leave. They're setting up the public to believe that and therefore justify the violence they're planning on engaging in. It's very ugly strategy, but I think you're exactly right. Well, you also wrote a piece about what's happening in Washington last night, and honestly, I think that, even where I live in Dallas, Texas, we heard a lot of concern expressed by people we know who have national security backgrounds, who've been Secret Service, other national security backgrounds, saying, if things get ugly, it could be even moving out of the downtown area into other areas of Dallas. So we had people expressing concern, even, we're way out in the, kind of more suburb area, but we heard people expressing that concern. And I think since the media doesn't give much publication to the riots that happened in Washington last night, to the conduct in Washington, people think, it was exaggerated. Nothing really bad happened. So lay it out for us, Kyle, and what you described in your article. What happened in Washington, the streets of Washington last night?
Sure. Well, I wouldn't describe it as a riot. It was definitely a march or a protest. It was a very aggressive one. But it was a protest or a march. It was almost, I would say, a shakedown cruise. So the night started in the evening with individuals gathering at Black Lives Matter Plaza, and it almost had a carnival-like feel to it. They had a local go-go band playing music. They had people dancing. It was pretty normal street theater type stuff. But as it got darker, we saw Antifa groups begin to put out calls to assemble the Black Bloc. Black Bloc is where you see those units of people moving in unison, all wearing black and wearing masks. And so they began to do that, and they began moving north out of Black Lives Matter Plaza, which is, so they were moving actually away from the White House, not towards it. But they took a march through D.C., heading in a generally northeasterly direction, before they finally ended up at about 2:30 in the morning outside the 4th precinct of the Metropolitan Police Department. There were a number of assaults connected with this, but it wasn't. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a riot. What I did see was a lot of intimidation of journalists, a very aggressive pushing on journalists, yelling at journalists. Some journalists had cameras taken or broken. So we did see a lot of that kind of intimidation, which I think is intended to set the tone for future days, to let journalists know that they will not be allowed to cover any parts of these events that Antifa and its allies do not want covered. So I think that was really the goal of last night, was to set the stage for future nights. We saw some protests also take place in places like Seattle and Portland, where there's a very active Antifa contingent, but mostly we're seeing calls for events tonight in places like Minneapolis and Chicago, as well as D.C. and Portland, and then we're also seeing calls for later in the week as well. I think as the rhetoric and the contest, the legal contest between the two campaigns heats up, the streets will heat up correspondingly.
I did want to talk about the journalist piece, and actually I noticed that you mentioned British author Douglas Murray. He's a very famous guy. Was he there?
He appeared to be there. I saw his social media, where he very bravely actually took video and pictures of Antifa changing into their black bloc, meaning abandoning their street clothes and putting on their black garb. And this is where they are often most opposed to being filmed or videoed or having their pictures taken. So they can be very, very aggressive when this happens. And he was pointing out in his post that other journalists were simply doing what Antifa wanted and not covering their behavior. And he pointed this out, and he was accosted for it. But as far as I know, he's safe.
Yeah, there was also, you made reference to at one point, 20 Antifa members reportedly sought to hunt and kill Blaze reporter Elijah Schaffer, who successfully evacuated from the protests unharmed. But it really brings up a point about the way the media in this country have handled, I agree you're saying this wasn't a riot, but they've handled all the conduct by Black Lives Matter, Antifa, you have shut down D.C., the Sunrise Movement behind the scenes. all of these groups engaging in different cities, different forms of violence. And at first, the media was covering it a great deal. We call the mainstream media was covering it. But there's almost been, as we came up toward the election, fewer and fewer stories. In fact, a lot of people were surprised to realize that the Portland riots and protests were still going on. They thought, hey, it all ended. That was a few weeks ago. That was months ago. And I think the media, to a certain degree, is complicit in not letting the American public realize that this is all still ongoing. And then what you're describing about the conduct last night outside in Washington was the protesters, this is Black Lives Matter protesters in Washington, that they were trying to kind of make the rule and draw the line in the sand. You cover us when we want, and if we don't want to be covered, you're going to be sorry if you cover us. Is that fair?
That's exactly right. And if you get a reputation for covering them in a way that they don't want, like this Blaze reporter does very well, I should point out, he covers them very well, then they will target you explicitly. They will know who you are, and they will look for you in these protests. They are quite savvy in terms of gathering intelligence, conducting surveillance on people that they know oppose them. So there is a real cost for people who want to get the truth out about how these operations are taking place.
It's an astonishing thing. I want to now turn and talk about the groups involved. And yesterday on the show, I played a video. There's an organization, Sunrise, and now there's another organization speaking of people trying to expose them, called Expose Sunrise. And they were involved. There was a video we played which had people who were actual current members, employees of the federal government in some level of bureaucracy, kind of online in a Zoom call. You can see their faces. I don't know if you saw it. Did you see this yesterday or see this incident, this Zoom call? Yeah.
Yeah, I had sources with access to the video.
Okay, good. So somehow I played that portions of the video yesterday, just to make the point that this is an example of when people say deep state doesn't exist or that's something, a concoction, not a right-wing extremist. These are people who work for the federal government, and they're talking about how openly they ought to be trying to help and what ways they could help the rioters, protesters, whatever you want to call them, as they engage in this effort to remove Trump from office. My point being, there is still a need, if President Trump succeeds in getting this second term, to seriously drain the swamp. But what I want to get to you with, Kyle, is, so this one group, that's the main group that was talking about violence yesterday, was Shut Down DC. What do you know about them and their backgrounds and connection?
Sure. So Shutdown DC is actually made up of a number of primarily eco-activist groups, some of whom have ties to as known labor organizers. So they are not people that are outside of the left-wing organizing space. They are well within what the left considers normal direct action protesting space. We saw them take to the streets this morning outside the RNC and outside Fox News to protest them. But they also are sponsored by a group called All Out DC, which is a DC Antifa group. So there are links between the more aggressive Antifa types, BLM types, and then the more traditional but still left-wing organizing types that you see in the environmental movement, that you see in the labor movement. So there's a wide, we called it in an article that I wrote at American Greatness, Antifa industry, where you have everything from public relations professionals to out-and-out anarchists, but they all exist within an ecosystem of cooperation amongst themselves. And so that's something that I think is very important to understand, because when people try to ask, how is it that these black-garbed anarchists are able to participate and move within these protests, that's why, because there's an ecosystem into which they can move. That isn't to say that every single one of these people behind Shutdown DC is violent or criminal per se, but they are part of a movement within which violent people swim.
Okay, that's a great summary. So I know you did it one time on my show weeks ago, but you talked a little about Antifa's decades-long history, where the kind of the roots of it, which has now become an active movement in America, but has its roots. And I'd love if you could give a quick summary of that again about who Antifa is, what it is.
Sure. Well, I think it's going to be especially important now because the real purpose of Antifa is to prevent mainstream normal political participation. They pretend to be about anti-fascism. They pretend to be against the far right or violent militias or something like that. But the reality is that their purpose is to prevent regular Americans from being able to speak their mind, from being able to attend protests or rallies, and these sorts of things. And so this is really ultimately what drives Antifa and the role that they play in this organizing universe. They come out of left-wing radical politics of the 1970s and 80s. They have connections to the Weather Underground and what was called the May 19th Communist Organization, these were the groups that were conducting some of the bombing and armored car robberies in the late 70s and early 80s. So their roots are in violent left-wing politics. And a lot of these guys never retired. They just essentially got promoted. A lot of them became professors. They became specialists in organizing, labor union organizers, these kinds of things. And they have continued to inculcate their ideology to the young people to today. So there's a sort of an unbroken chain between the days of rage in the late 60s and what we see today.
And perhaps I'm misremembering, but even before the late 60s, Antifa originally had roots, or an organization by that name wasn't even before that in Germany. Am I misremembering that?
That's right. 1932, Anti-Fascist Action is founded by the Communist Party of Germany. And that's really where this technique of alienating and minimizing the mainstream in order to achieve politics took place. So this was in the Weimar Republic. The communists sought to alienate the Social Democrats and other liberal and conservative parties and make politics a contest between the communists and the Nazis. And so that was the goal of Antifa then. And it's very much similar to what they're trying to do now. So while there's not a direct connection to the early days of the 1930s, there is an ideological and there is a sort of tactical or strategic connection in that they play a similar role.
And can you say again what that similar role is today for Antifa? There's the similar role of what they're trying to do. Their mission today is to?
Their mission today is to, as much as possible, prevent mainstream regular Americans from participating in politics or being able to speak their minds freely. They do this first and foremost by equating people who seek to participate in politics, who support, the current duly elected president, Donald Trump, by associating him with fascism and his supporters with fascism, which of course nobody in America wants to be a fascist. And then second of all, they do this with violence. So first of all, you will be denigrated. You will be accused of believing things you don't believe. Your neighbors will be told that you're a terrible person. And then second of all, you risk violence. If you try to speak out, if you try to attend a rally, if you try to attend a demonstration, if you try to engage in the media or report on things that they don't want reported on. So that is their ultimate goal.
It is so great for Americans to understand this. It's a very, understatement, a very toxic time in America, a very divided time. And even for people who are strong patriots, love the Constitution, I mean, speaking for myself and millions of Americans, you actually support the First Amendment, the actual notion of the robust exchange of ideas, the rights of various people to hold opinions unlike yours, that kind of, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. That's an American spirit, an American idea that, yeah, you can have a protest and a march for something that, the majority of Americans don't like. That's the beauty of the First Amendment. But this is antithetical to that idea. This Antifa, I mean, it's kind of funny because people on our side, or on the conservative side, tend to say, well, everyone has a voice, but what Antifa is trying to say is, no, we decide who has a voice, and it's not anyone that we disagree with. And that's
exactly right.
Yeah, profoundly un-American idea, profoundly. Okay, so Kyle, this is amazing. I'm so glad I've forgotten actually that I love what you wrote about all these things. I love talking about shutdown DC, talking about Antifa, understanding what's happening on the ground in Washington. And, it's a funny thing. I feel concerned that if ultimately President Trump is determined by, it's going to probably be the Supreme Court, determined that he won this election, won re-election, I don't know what kind of situation America will be on the ground. I'm not even sure these groups, though, are going to be silent and go back into their caves if we have a Biden victory. What's your sense about that? Is the Biden victory mean, okay, we're all done and we're happy, we've gotten our goals? Or do you have a sense, maybe you don't know yet, but do you have a sense that they still would be engaging in violence because they have a bigger mission than just the Biden victory?
Oh, no, they've been quite explicit about this. They have openly said this will continue whether Trump wins or Biden wins. Really, we may even see more activity if Biden wins because there will be a sense that they can push the Biden administration to accept radical policies that they couldn't get out of the Trump administration. For example, they may certainly feel that they are winning if they get a Biden administration. Lisa Fithian, who is a major anarchist organizer, who was one of the major trainers on that shutdown DC event, said, fight for the enemy that you want. And the enemy that they want is Biden, because they know that they can push him around. They know that they can push him towards radical policies. So that's ultimately what this is about. For them, the fight with Trump is just about getting an opportunity to target the Biden administration and to force them to accept radical policies like the abolition of police and so on and so forth. So this does not stop. You get a sense that there's a promise from certain elements of the Democratic Party and the liberal media that, if Trump goes away, this all ends. But it's not true. This isn't going to stop, no matter who wins the election. These groups have to be dealt with because they are fundamentally insurrectionist groups that seek the overthrow of the U.S. Constitution.
I'm so glad you said that, because I've said similar ideas for a long time. At some point, these groups, I'm always on and on about the robust exchange of ideas, love the First Amendment. But if what you're pushing is the overthrow of America and the ending of the Constitution and the radical leftist, I've been calling it Marxist revolution, you don't, at some point your violence cannot continue. And when what you're advocating is insurrection and actually overthrow the American government, that doesn't count. That's not protected by the First Amendment. Kyle Shideler, I love talking with you. So glad you were available today. Can you share with the listeners how to find your writings and where? I know you're a Center for Security Policy. You write for several outlets now, right?
Sure. So you can find all my work at Center for Security Policy, securefreedom.org. You can also check me out on Twitter. It's just my last name, Shideler, K, on Twitter. And I put a lot of stuff out there, especially on what the radicals are up to. I'll be tracking them again tonight, so we will see what happens.
Kyle Shideler, thanks so much for taking time to join me today.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, great guy. You definitely should read his writing. His last name, he was telling you on Twitter, is Shideler, Shidelerk, @Shideler K. Really a great resource.